To the program, everyone. Charles Moscowitz. Thanks for joining me. Dooovid is here. We do this often on Thursday evenings live at 10 p.m. Dooovid, there's so much going on right now. I want to just get into a little issue that's sort of more of a kind of a housekeeping issue. It's a bit of historic, if you will. I was listening to an interview with E. Michael Jones. I don't know if you follow his interviews. And he never really gives the name of the person that was doing the interview. He just posted on his
BitChute.
Not BitChute. I usually catch him on one of the other serves. Could have been BitChute. And it was strictly an audio. It wasn't a visual. So I think it was more of a podcaster. And they were getting into questions of finance, questions of, he wrote a book called Barren Metal, which is about usury and the history of usury. It's pretty interesting. I haven't read it, but there probably are a lot of things in that book that, you
He
have
sent
it.
me a free copy. I even have it autographed.
There you go. Did you read it?
I'm still like 400 pages into it. It's been on my desk for like 2 years now. It's pretty dense.
Yes.
And it's he traces an interesting history. But it's interesting, but it's a hard read, and it's
Was that before he became anti-Jewish or after?
Well, I don't think he's anti-Jewish, honestly, but I mean he says things that are horribly anti-Semitic, but just the fact that he still talks to you, he'd probably talk to me.
Oh yeah, he would. But the thing is that he was.
I don't
really want to talk too
relatively
much.
Defensive of Jews in many ways, but if
I
you
don't want to
separate,
talk too much about him, but I just will say that when I first started doing radio, I had him. I was actually loved his books. They said nothing about Jews at all. Except maybe in passing. I particularly liked Degenerate Moderns, and he did a couple of other books that I thought were extraordinary. And then I kind of got out of doing radio for many years. I was doing other things. I had a family, I had a business. And then I started getting back in around maybe 2010, 2011. And so I remembered him, and I looked him up, and I was horrified to find all this stuff about Judaism. He had written a book called The Jewish Revolutionary Spirit, which I read very carefully. And it doesn't really mention a Jew until about halfway through a 1,000-page book. It's mostly about the struggle between Catholics and Protestants and how the Protestants are Judaized. And he talks about different groups being Judaized. America is Judaized. And I remember having him on and saying, "Hey, if America is Judaized, I'm happy to own that one." The Jewish. If we are a Jewish spirit, great. But on this particular interview, he said something that I just am trying to grapple with because I don't know a lot about it, in that he made the accusation that the Talmud is a blueprint for teaching people how to deceive and how to violate law. And it is done, in a sense, it gets into Jewish law, but then it has reams of information about how to sidestep that law without actually violating it. And that furthermore, he talks about this idea that the Talmud, and you've kind of implied this, that it's involved in protecting the Jewish people, regardless of whether or not they're involved in terrible things. Because to criticize another Jew is somehow appeasing anti-Semites or whatnot. And so I've been thinking about that. I've been thinking about both of these issues. And I guess that you have I don't have very much knowledge of the Talmud. I did a little study of it and found it to be interesting, but not really my cup of tea in terms of looking and parsing every word and figuring out, I'm not criticizing here, but getting into like all the different permutations and nuances. It's just not I tend to be a little bit more of a pashut student and a rational student. So, but again, I'm not bringing this up to criticize it at all, but I think you've had a little bit more of a delve into the Talmud. So what say you with regard to whether or not the Talmud is a blueprint for deception?
Well, I mean, obviously that's inaccurate. I'm saying that
Yeah,
you could take statements and like I said, like, okay, like the mainstream understanding that getting a Jew out of prison or redeeming him is irregardless of guilt, and you could pull statements out where the Talmud, you could say, trains us to deceive, but obviously the Talmud is about serving God and obeying biblical law and understanding Mosaic law. Opens up with brachos about prayers, when to say Kriya Shema, and the daily prayers and farming laws. So even if you could pull out, I took 25 years I've been studying Talmud. Thank God I finished Talmud, through the Daf Yomi, being diligent, studying a page a day, and took over 7 years, thousands of pages. Plus I studied in yeshiva, where like commentaries, where we spent long periods of time on a few pages. So to just cherry pick and say that's really what it's about is ludicrous. I mean, just because
right.
obviously
Yeah.
it's the foundation of our religion. The purpose of our religion is to obey the Mosaic law and to serve God, and that includes things that, if you picked out, could sound horrific, and even God forbid that I think the Eigen I forget the Dutch scholar who almost converted to Judaism and wrote Judaism Unveiled, was like a 3,000 page book or 3,000 collections. So I mean, you could even pull out thousands and thousands of statements from the Talmud that might make us look bad, but to say that that's the purpose of it is ridiculous. And I'm not sure if Michael Jones, just to say, like, I judge people on actions, not off of beliefs or even what they say necessarily. And like, I worked in New York City, and what we were talking last week, like your claim that the Holocaust changed Christian belief, and I was thinking, like, I don't think so. Like, even African Americans, like people I deal with on a day-to-day basis, still kind of have that attitude. But you could have productive dealings and friendships with people that unequivocally think that, God forbid, we killed Jesus and we're cursed. But so to say that are they trustworthy? Are they going to steal from us? Are they going to do harm to us? Would they defend us if we were in a fight? But if you ask them, say like, no, this is what I believe. Like even if it was like Lvov, who the comments about Hitler, and to say that if he's convinced that Hitler was Jewish, and the reason he did it was because he himself was partly Jewish. I told you the polling that 25% of Germans think that the Hitler was partly Jewish, and that's why he was so obsessed with Jews. But that's just a belief. And if you judge a person on action, like I would put Michael Jones action wise pretty philo-Semitic. Like in belief, he's obviously one of the most virulent anti-Semites, and he's out there all the time, and that's all he talks about. And he's kind of like Adam Green, who's a pretty nice guy, relatively friendly
Right.
guy. He'd probably help
But
you
he
out.
has this obsession with Jews.
Well, by saying that he honestly believes that, and he thinks he's doing some sort of service, not only to the world but to us ourselves, by telling us that. And so you have to differentiate that, and that's why like I would put it straight on action. I told that guy from the Crucible, Andrew Wilson, who I'm not sure if he's going to come on the show. He's, I mean, maybe busy or just hard to book. But I was like, I'm really only concerned with violence. We'll talk about Israel hopefully a little bit. There was a lot of violence this week. I'm not so concerned with what people believe and say, and I'm even content to say that like 25% of Americans probably agree with Adam Green. Michael Jones is saying what really half of the world used to think.
Right. I mean, look, I generally think there's been a change, but we talked about that. Now, the only source that Michael Jones uses for this, and I've heard
you're
him.
talking change in belief. If people like, even though I believe that, I wouldn't, like people have to be defended. You can't discriminate. You can't hurt people. And that's why a lot of Jews, like, like the Harvard is going BDS, why Jews go for universal humanism and say like, discrimination won't end till all people are discriminated against. in like the fear, God forbid, like we said last week, the poll that half of Israelis fear that there's going to be another Holocaust, and to say, well, do we really have to be scared of what people believe or even what they say? Is it possible you could have law and order? And it's like, well, the cops and the government and self-defense. Who
Right.
cares if that's what he believes? Who cares if he wants to
Well, we,
convince?
we, we should be concerned, but you're right in the sense that the main concern is to defend ourselves and to take the necessary steps. Now, Jones uses
I would
the
say you have
quote,
friends. Like
can
I
I
said,
just
I
say
have
this for the,
friends that ardently believe that. Even as a kid, African American
yes, I
friends
get that,
who were convinced, but I was still their friend.
of
Like they
course,
never
and
backed
as
down.
am I.
Till today, that's what they believe because that's how they understand the Bible. But it didn't affect us having a long-term friendship.
No, and I likewise with myself. He quotes a Heinrich Graetz, the 19th century Jewish encyclopedist, to back up his claim, because Graetz apparently has one comment in there that it's a 13-volume set. It's actually pretty interesting. It's a set that happens to be in my synagogue, and I've spent some time reading it. But I think Graetz tends to be one of these Enlightenment types, Haskalah Jews. I mean, he has somewhat of a negative view of Orthodox Judaism. And so you have to view him in that context. And there's one comment in there where Great says that the Talmud is a blueprint for deception. That was his opinion, and I think it was unfortunately a pretty defamatory comment. But you also talked about you basically said to me that because I'm critical of liberal Jews, therefore I'm appeasing anti-Semites. And I think that I was thinking about that, and this comes from a tradition in Judaism that I don't think it's so much religious. I think it's more psychological, and it's more, a byproduct of being in the diaspora. In that, like any group, you have a certain circling of the wagons when there's bad news, when somebody does something bad, because there's a fear that you might end up damaging the group or somehow playing into the hands of your enemies. And this becomes magnified when, first of all, there's a sense of victimology that it's an us versus them. And secondly, when it's a religious group, because then it takes on a bit of a cloak of divinity, that this is violating God and that this is, somehow, blaspheming. And I think that there are variations of this in every group, religious and secular, historically and today. It's part of human nature. It's part of every family. We tend to want to downplay the bad news and not necessarily have that become known because it could be damaging. It's part of our human nature for ourselves. There are things we don't want to talk about publicly that we do or that we think because it could be damaging. So I think that this is, it's a complex issue. If you have a situation where, and I've heard you say this before, and I think this it's magnified in Jewish groups that are very religious, where you have like a Rebbe who is very autocratic and by nature would be, and that there's a hierarchy that's very set. Whereas if you have someone in that group that's doing some very bad things, I mean, they're a child molester, God forbid, or they're doing something very illegal, there is this idea that to expose them is somehow hurting the Jewish people or hurting God. And, I kind of get that. But at the same time, ultimately, I think we have to expose things like this because it hurts the Jewish people more if you don't. And to do it, you're basically, you're excising the cancer and the bad news so that ultimately the body can become healed and healthy. So, what is it? Because you've said this before, what is the actual Jewish tradition around that?
Well, I mean, it's a specific one of the 613 mitzvahs, a prohibition called the Meiser, which means to give over. And that exposing, not necessarily, but I mean, handing over to the non-Jewish authorities, being a traitor is one of the most severest sins. In fact, there's many listings historically that list that as the single most severest sins that, you could look historically why that would be, from a biblical, like, breaking the Sabbath, but uh, exposing in terms of calling out ideas as opposed to handing over to the authorities to be punished by the authorities.
Mhm.
And so like child molestation or something that has been a big issue in the Orthodox community, where many leading authorities have said, yes, you should hand over child molesters to the leading authorities. The mainstream Orthodox opinion is no, that it's forbidden, and if you do, you're out, and that even if a person is 100% guilty of child molestation and in the U.S. prison system, that the mitzvah of redeeming a captive applies to them, and that there's an obligation to help that person get out of prison, even if they're 100% guilty.
Mhm.
If you use the word exposing, which is not necessarily the same thing, like calling out ideas or publicly, if you're saying to a non-Jewish audience, and like, I was saying, last week, like, okay, are you an apologist for conservative anti-Semites? And, do Jews do what's in their best interest? And if the majority of Jews think Donald Trump is an anti-Semite, you might think that's ludicrous. He's even got Jewish grandkids. And I mentioned like Pat Buchanan, and, because he's probably a much more clear example of, Donald Trump is more controversial within the Jewish community, but to label, and it's like, I don't label anyone. I think it's unproductive, and I even agree with Sergei Lvov, who probably was listening to Orthodox rabbis, that anti-Semitism is more internally caused by us. But Pat Buchanan on his Wikipedia page, 20% of it's dedicated to accusations of anti-Semitism, and even William F. Buckley wrote like a 40,000 word essay accusing Pat Buchanan of being an anti-Semite. And you could defend him and say like, no, I mean and it's also like, because International Holocaust, remember we talked about it. If you want to talk about it more, anti-Semitism could be a good strategy for a Republican, for a conservative. And you say, well, I'm a conservative, and like, I like, trying to get Jews to vote Republican, but from a certain perspective, that anti-Semitism could be a good strategy. You're just recognizing that most Jews are liberal, most Jews are on the opposite side, like abortion, and you think, okay, like the Jewish groups probably, even though Orthodox Jews, a certain element of Jews are pro-choice, pro-life, that the vast majority are pro-choice, and organizational Judaism will probably try to do everything possible to keep abortion legal, that you could consider anti-Semitism a good strategy for political issues like immigration, abortion, by attacking your opponent and just saying, you're not going to attack liberalism or the idea, you're going to attack the people, and just say a group, that our enemy, God forbid, is this group of people who is overwhelmingly on the opposite side. And it's okay, like, obviously we disagree, we're pro-Jewish, but would you recognize that that's to some extent a good strategy? I don't mean like from a moralistic point of view, but a political view, that certainly historically, possibly in America, you think like Nick Fuentes or various right-wing personalities, that anti-Semitism is a relatively good political strategy sometimes.
Well, I'll talk about that in a minute, but I just want to get back to this issue of the Jewish community covering up for somebody who's involved in terrible, immoral crimes like child molestation. And,
exposing versus defending being punished by the authorities. So if you say, okay, exposing, that is a finer law, that's probably not like the sin of being a moiser, versus handing over to the authorities and to be punished by the legal system.
Well, the thought that I have on it is that, while on the one hand, I understand this idea of keeping something in-house, look, the Catholic Church had a big scandal.
It's a biblical commandment. It's not like an idea. It's a biblical sin to be a moiser, to hand over a fellow Jew to the non-Jewish
Okay,
authorities.
well, as I say, I get that. I think every organization has an element of that. The Catholic Church had a big scandal around this back in the early.
I'm saying it's straight biblical mitzvahs, like Moses.
Fine, you already said
It's-
that.
it's-
Let me make my point that, when the church had their scandal in Boston and Cardinal Law had to literally leave town because he would have been arrested. They weren't sure whether his Vatican status could stop that. The guy that took over from him, this Bishop Lennon, he didn't last long. He was he spoke to either a reporter or he spoke to somebody, and it was on camera where he basically said, you are anti-Catholic by talking about this. You're bringing terrible defamation to our church, and you're anti-God because you're exposing. And this was a young guy who had been sexually molested by a priest. And it was not a popular thing for him to have said, and he disappeared shortly after that. But the point I'm making is that this is something that you find in most groups to varying degrees. Now, my question, though, in Judaism is that if we are to say that this is a command and that we're not supposed to expose a criminal.
Hand over, you're using the word expose.
All right, fine.
So
Hand
if
over.
you say, like, I might agree with you that you should expose and say, like, you got to stop this and we're going to expose you. And that's not the same thing as being a moiser and handing them over to the authorities.
All right, well,
to
then
be
my
punished
question
by
is.
them. So if it's possible to
maybe I'm
expose
going
them to
about
stop
this.
their bad deed.
Okay, I'm
without
going
them
about
being
it in
punished by the
a
legal
roundabout
system.
way. Let me get to my point and please, let me just say this. All right, as opposed to handing them over to a non-Jewish authority, is there not a mechanism within the Jewish community where someone can be punished for these crimes without?
They can be exposed.
So they can.
You could hang up a poster on your synagogue saying, like, beware this guy. You could take him to rabbinic court. So
But isn't it? Yeah, is there due process?
Expose them. And you possibly could even expose them to Gentiles. The sin refers to handing them over to authorities for legal punishment.
Handing them over to, what about handing them over to Jewish authorities within the community?
Well, I'm saying you should do that. You're supposed to do that.
Okay, that's all. That's what I wanted to know.
That's why I was picking on you using the word expose. That's ambiguous and saying, like, I think, even the strictest Haredi might say, well, no, we do expose people, in a certain extent. First, you try to handle it. And there's the law of rebuke, that first you rebuke somebody privately. And, but if the person doesn't accept the private rebuke, you're supposed to expose them. Rebuke is a mitzvah also. And, the law is very clear that you should privately rebuke a person, but if they don't listen, you should publicly rebuke them, versus what you call being a moser, which would refer to them some greater punishment. So being embarrassed by the community, like a shunning and shaming, is one of our methods, as opposed to saying, like the U.S. system, you could spend years of your life in prison for child molestation, as opposed to, like if you don't stop, you've been warned, and we're going to expose you, and we're not going to let you be around kids, and we're going to hang up posters, and we're going to tell.
Well, as long as that's happening, then
handing them over to the authorities to go in prison, that's questionably a breach of one of the strongest biblical commandments.
What if it's murder?
Even if it's murder.
Okay, so look.
I'm saying
let me look
that
at
it's a
this.
mitzvah. I'm going to say very clearly, it does not matter if the person's guilty or not, that you should help a fellow Jew get out of prison. To redeem them from captivity has nothing to do with guilt.
Okay, so this sort of adds a little light to the story, because there is a mechanism within the Jewish community to deal with someone who is guilty of these sorts of terrible moral violations of the Torah, actually, and of the society. Now, in the state of
extradited to Israel, you say, okay, like,
well, that's what I was about to ask
they
about.
Deserve to be in prison.
The state of Israel is the Jewish state.
Israeli prison.
Can in Israel someone be prosecuted without in this Talmudic context? Because after all, Israel is a Jewish state with a Jewish court system and a Jewish infrastructure of government. So if someone commits one of these crimes in Israel, what happens?
Well, Israel has a lot of Jews in prison. We have a prison system.
Okay, fine.
I'm saying if there was a Jew who was guilty of an egregious crime that deserved to be in prison, even according to Israeli law, it would still be a mitzvah to have them extradited from, the U.S. or Thailand. It happens, relatively frequently, to Israel. And the question of guilt is irrelevant. So if the person did the most egregious crime, it's still a mitzvah to redeem them from captivity. It's completely irrelevant whether they're innocent or guilty.
And that includes in Israel.
No, in Israel, not.
Okay. Now
And that's why I'm saying that redeeming from captivity.
All right. No, I get that.
Would mean extradition to an Israeli prison.
All right. So I get that. But here's the problem with this. The United States is a secular nation. We have a system of laws here, and we are loyal American citizens. I have a little problem with the idea of a Jewish group or any group that covers up a crime in our secular society. And I think that,
covering up, you don't have to resort to illegal measures and saying, not saying like you should break the law in order to get, you're redeeming a person from captivity, to say that you should break the US law to do that is not necessarily what I'm saying, although some rabbis.
Well, you're not breaking the law.
There's plenty of methods within the law of the US, like Rabashkin, you get a presidential pardon or, get the sentence reduced, but there's many legal measures to redeem a captive. I'm not necessarily referring to breaking the foreign country's law to
a person them. American is not breaking the law if they, turn a blind eye to a crime because someone's a Jew. If you see somebody murder his wife and this, are you breaking a law by not turning them in? I mean, the question, it's a moral question.
No, I'm not talking about breaking the law to redeem them. You're saying like if you're referring to, trying to get the person light sentencing, let's just say for the sake of argument, doing everything within the law to see to it that the person isn't in captivity, the prison system, not to say that, but say because captivity is considered unjust, the prison system. So if it was lashes or something like that, or even
what if you're a Jewish prosecutor working as a district attorney and you're supposed to help put people in prison who are criminals, and one of those people might happen to be a Jew? I mean, that's your job as an American.
I'm not sure if there's. I honestly, I can't think of any Orthodox Jewish district attorney. I think there was Cy Vance, or there was semi-Orthodox like district attorneys.
Well, Orthodox. I mean, there have been Jewish prosecutors and attorneys general. Look, the Attorney General of the United States right now is a Jew, Merrick Garland, right? He's going to oversee investigations that could put people in prison. I mean, whether they be a Jew or non-Jew. I mean, that's the way our civil society works. That's the way all civil societies work.
It's very difficult because it's a straight biblical injunction, and it's one of the most severe ones. So it's very difficult to. And I'm not talking about breaking U.S. law. I'm saying, for the sake of argument, let's say doing everything within the U.S. law to redeem captives. They're not going outside.
Well, maybe that could be interpreted in such a way that you could maybe have them do a less of a sentence, instead of spending the rest of their life in prison, maybe they'll just spend 20 years or something like that.
You could hire the best lawyer. You could, there's many methods within the law to get a person off of
right.
punishment.
And I know the Jewish courts in medieval Europe were, yes, they had the death penalty, but they were always much more lenient in those questions than the non-Jewish courts, which is why you'd have a lot of Christian criminals, want to have their trial before a Jewish court because they knew they would have a better break. Anyway, you also were making comments indicating that you felt that I was appeasing anti-Semites because I'm critical of liberal Jews. Now, you've been
because you speak to conservatives that are considered anti-Semitic, and then you agree with their criticisms of liberal Jews.
Yeah, but it's not because I agree with them whether I'm talking to anybody. I am critical of liberal Jews, whoever I'm talking to, not because I'm trying to hurt Judaism. You've been critical of the state of Israel on this program. It's a Jewish state. In a sense, I could say that I've even said this to you. I know that it's maybe a little hyperbolic, but I've said you sound worse than Hamas. I mean, would you not be playing into the hands of Israel's real enemies by engaging in that kind of talk?
Well, this mean me
My
talking.
answer to that question is
If I
no,
was
by the way.
talking to people, if I was talking to Hamas, if I was talking to, people like, someone that are openly considered, so if I was talking to an enemy of Israel, I would probably be more defensive of Israel. I'm talking to my fellow Jew, be more critical.
I also think that you are running under an assumption that my audience would be, because they may be, however many people I have, who knows, but that they might be conservative, which they probably are, and therefore they're anti-Semites. I don't accept that. I don't think they're anti-Semitic, and I also don't think that taking an anti-Semitic stance is going to help conservatives. I think it's going to play into the hands, frankly, of liberals who want to label conservatives anti-Semitic and who may be anti-Semitic themselves.
I meant considered anti-Semitic by the majority or plurality.
Well, either they are or they're not, Dooovid. I don't care if the majority thinks they are. I don't think they are. I don't think that conservatives are anti-Semitic any more or less than liberals, and probably less. Sure, I can't vouch for every person that listens to me. Maybe there are some anti-Semites, but the point is that as a whole, and we have to talk generally because otherwise we can't communicate. I don't make the association of conservatism and anti-Semitism. I don't believe that they are. And, I think that, as I said, there might be a few, but there's a few anti-Semites you'll find you lift up any group, you'll find a few anti-Semites. So when I criticize liberal Jews or liberal non-Jews, I'm doing it because of their ideology, not because I'm in any way, playing up to anti-Semites. I assume that they're not. I mean, maybe I get what you're saying in that if I'm talking to a very conservative who is an anti-Semite and I criticize liberal Jews, I might be feeding stereotypes of Jews into their thinking, and that could be inadvertently on my part a bad thing. Maybe that's true. In a sense, if you spoke about Israel in a negative way, there could be anti-Israel people out there that are not Jewish, that who very well may be on the left, I may add, and you might be encouraging them. They might say, you see, Dooovid is a Jew and he's speaking against Israel. They might use that. So I get what you're saying in that way, I suppose.
We're feeding. If I was, okay, we're talking here, and hopefully we have a largely Jew-friendly audience. But if I was speaking to someone who was anti-Israel, and then God forbid, I'm feeding him more into their you want to know, so bad about the Jews, like I'll tell you bad about the Jews, God forbid, that the danger. And that's, somewhat the heart of this week's news with Sergei Lavov's statement that and even I learned that in Jewish schools that we're the heart of anti-Semitism, and even to say that the worst anti-Semites are Jews ourselves, or even partially blooded Jews. And Lavrov made the comment that it was he said, actually, he could be wrong when he said that Hitler has had Jewish blood. I mean, that's a historical mystery because no one knows who his grandfather was, and even in his lifetime, and there were even Jews who claimed that in his lifetime, saying it doesn't matter. It's largely believed to be inaccurate, but it's unknown. But he himself said that he's not sure about that, but he did say that I don't know the expression, the English translation, if he said the rabbis or the learned Jews said that the worst anti-Semites are Jews, and that's why I made the point. I thought Christopher Van Jerknes was a lot more vitriolic than even E. Michael Jones. And
well, he's very vitriolic, but something in a sense.
But I'm saying that he's a quarter Jewish, and he openly says it, and to connect that to say, well, to me it makes sense.
Van Jerknes is a
quarter. Well, I'm saying that the reason Jerknes is more vitriolic, in so to say, use the word anti-Semitism, is his Jewish blood, and that even E. Michael Jones.
So what does his Jewish blood have to do with anything? I mean, how does that make him more vitriolic toward Jews? I mean, are you saying that biologically? I mean, what are you talking about?
Well, I'm saying his level of statements of negativity about the Talmud and Judaism is at a much higher level than really anyone else I've talked to.
Because he has a Jewish grandparent.
Well, I mean, if he's claiming that, that you even link things like the blood libel are true, and that the purpose of the Talmud is not just trickery or dishonesty, but to actually God forbid, like enslave and kill the goyim, God forbid. But to say that, yeah, if if I flat out said, like, yeah, I think that him being partly Jewish feeds into his hatred, and that his
How
hatred
so?
is probably more so than someone who is, let's say, completely non-Jewish, like E. Michael Jones or Adam Green.
Why would you say that? I mean, I don't make the connection. What does it matter if he has some Jewish ancestry? How does that affect anything?
Well, one thing our texts say, like our rabbis historically said it, that the hatred for the sages comes more from us, and probably because if you want it, like the term self-hating, uh because he's trying to distance himself from what he is, so he makes it look worse than it actually is. So if it's someone like Adam Green or E. Michael Jones, is like, yeah, I'm a little skeptical and worried, versus the person who's mixed blooded, even
I don't think blood has anything to do with it. Look, I mean, Dooovid, first of all, I mean,
there's our own statements in our tradition that say it,
that somebody's blood has something to do with something.
that the worst hatred of Jews comes from
No, from Jews who are conscious Jews and who are part of the Jewish experience. I mean, sure. I mean, this is
here the Pete said straight up, like, we didn't kill ourselves, but is it possible maybe we
no.
did?
This is what Lavrov
Like,
was
no,
saying.
there's non-Jews out there that so vitriolically hated us for no reason and killed us. Is it possible that there were former partial Jews that actually were so vitriolic hatred against the
No,
Jewish people?
look, I don't know if
that-
it's there are Jews who have been, and I think in that sense, Lavrov is probably right. We just talked about this person who happens to be a Jew who has gotten the Harvard Crimson to sign on to BDF, right? I mean, we know that there are Jews like this, that they
There's
are
also in
so
famous
filled,
stories,
and they're more filled with rage at the Jewish people and at Israel than non-Jews are, and they are actually Jews who grew up as Jews. But if somebody has, I mean, a Jewish ancestry, and they're not really, he was never Jewish, he didn't grow up Jewish, maybe he was aware of this, but not more than that. I don't see how that affects somebody.
well, I mean, God forbid, maybe he was an orphan, and according to
Right.
him, if his Jewish grandfather abandoned
All right, maybe if something happened and the Jewish grandfather was part of his life and that he was a Jew and that he was a bad
or
guy,
abandoned him.
sure. I mean, look, Torquemada had a Jewish background, right? The Spanish Inquisition. He was, but in his case, he he had converted to Catholicism under duress, and then he looked back with hatred at the Jews, and he was one of the chief architects pushing Isabella and Ferdinand into the Spanish Inquisition. He was one of his was a very evil figure, and he had a Jewish background, but he did he was brought up a Jew, I believe. I don't think he was it was a converso type situation. But if somebody has like a Jewish grandparent and I mean, are you saying it's like a biological thing? I mean, it's nothing to do with anything. I mean, if Hitler had a Jewish grandfather, God forbid, and I'm not saying he did, he probably had no awareness of this, or if he did, it was just something on paper, or what? I mean, we don't know what the background would be there.
Well, I mean, it was saying that specifically if he had a Jewish grandfather, meaning that he's a patrilineal Jew who's not Jewish according to Jewish law, and that's the sense of at least a spiritual hatred, is that he bears the Judaism, but he's not part of Judaism, and that I mean, it's I'd have to look for exact references, but it's brought down historically, like textual, that specifically children of patrilineal Jews that become the worst enemies of the Jewish people.
No, I believe that.
Because of this dynamic relation that they're considered Jewish by the non-Jews and they're considered non-Jewish by the Jews, so that pushes them
It does.
to,
I believe that I agree with you on
to
Dooovid.
push a greater hatred towards the Jewish people, because that, you know, they get pushed in as being Jewish by the non-Jews. And, you know, if it's someone like Blinken or something like that, you know, where if you read the, you know, the anti-Semitic, he's Jewish. And I don't know if he has a Jewish mother or not, but,
Right.
you know, saying like, if it's straight up, you know, say like, no, he's not Jewish according to Jewish law.
Right.
And that's the source of, you know, this, you could it even be murderous hatred, God forbid.
No, look, David, I actually think there is some evidence to show that people who have like one Jewish parent, and they were not brought up Jewish,
I'm a
they
matrilineal Jew because I'm considered
so there you go.
Jewish. I'm considered Jewish by the majority of the Jewish people. But if you're a patrilineal Jew
But your father
and
was not
you're
Jewish.
rejected from the Jewish people by the majority of the
Yeah,
Jewish
that could be
people,
very angering. No, sure. But even so, I mean, I'll give you an example. I mean, the anti-Israel movement, the BDF movement, you know, the Jews for the peace in Palestine, whatever the hell they call themselves. Most of the Jewish people in that group have one non-Jewish parent, and they have this resentment, especially if the mother was not Jewish, that, you know, this anger at Judaism, and that, you know, Judaism does have some very strict rules and laws about that, and I could appreciate where someone can be angry. And then you have some, like there was this rabbi in Israel who was not recognizing legitimate conversions to Orthodox Judaism. I can give you, I mean, my understanding is that he didn't recognize Ivanka Trump's conversion. And she was pretty angry about that because she loves Judaism. You know, she's an observant Jew, and she's like, hey, this is, you know, this isn't right here. So, you know, I can appreciate people's anger at that. And I think that that there is a very large segment of the anti-Israel movement that is made up of people who have one Jewish parent and one non-Jewish parent. I mean, it's kind of almost a humorous comment, but, and I don't like to talk about my own family, but my daughter went to a Yiddish a thing in Massachusetts, where there's the Steiner Center, and over a summer when she was in high school, and there was a real group of anti-Israel people in this group who, as I just mentioned, one parent who's Jewish and one parent who's not Jewish. And one of the guys said to her, and he said, this is incredible, this movement, this anti-Israel movement. This is the first time I feel like a Jew. You know, this is like my introduction to Judaism for the first time. And so, yeah, I mean, I know that's anecdotal, but I think that there is a tendency there.
Yeah, I mean, it could also be, you know, if it was the Bolsheviks or, you know, it's tough to know. And, you know, that's why I said, like, you focus on actions, not beliefs. And, you know, even with Christopher M. Jerkness, it's just ideas, even if it's vitriolic and it's the worst of them, that you know, he might relatively be a nice guy and nonviolent and trustworthy and honest, even though he's, you know, from what I've seen, saying the
But he's embraced some very, very bizarre conspiracy theories about Jews. I've heard him speak.
Well, I mean, he's saying the worst. He's saying the purpose of our religion is to kill Gentiles, God forbid.
Yeah,
it's like the
that's
worst
right.
of any. I mean, I'm just saying like the blood,
Can't
like
get worse
the
than
blood
that.
libel, but he's saying that blood libel is true, and we want to do it to everyone, God forbid. And that's, you're really the worst of, you know, makes E. Michael Jones look like
look like Moses.
I mean,
No,
just saying,
exactly.
you're like we're a little bit dishonest, and
E. Michael Jones looks like Ben Gurion next to him. No, I'm just, I don't know, I could do, or he looks like Soloveitchik. I always like those analogies. Is it?
there could be. I also
It makes
like a
Jimmy
greater
Carter look like
Judaism.
Winston Churchill. You know, I don't know.
I mean, because a lot of patrilineal Jews will help the Jewish people, and you have sympathy.
Oh, of course, of course.
And even in Israel, he's saying that you know, even Mamzeris, that you know, the marriage status, that according to a lot of Orthodox Haredi people, that the majority of Israelis are Mamzerim, and you know,
That's
there's
very
also
insulting. I get that.
a hatred of Mamzerim I mean, God forbid.
Even if they're born Jewish to a Jewish mother, they're still mamzerim.
The idea halakhically is if a Jewish woman has relationships with a Jewish man out of wedlock, that they're considered
What if they're having a
married.
Jewish
Well, I mean,
relationship
the
with their
logic is
husband?
very simple. It's based on biblical law that the act of sexual relations is a form of marriage. So if
Right,
if the
that I get.
majority of Israeli women are promiscuous with Jewish men, they're considered married to the first Jewish man that they had relations with, and then they go on to have children with a different Jewish man. That's a mamzer. And
Yeah, but Dooovid, I mean, not to get into a topic here,
I
but
was saying
some
from
of
a strict level that many of the Haredi rabbis hold that the majority of Israelis are mamzerim because most Jewish women have relations with before they get married with a person that they don't
so
get
so
married
then
to.
they're
And
not
then,
committing adultery with their husband because they were technically married to the first man they had sex with. But Dooovid, I mean, some of these same Haredim, don't they have? I mean, I don't want to get into out of school talk here, but I believe they have concubines.
I mean, God forbid. I mean, maybe some of the
Some of the
richer
very,
ones
very religious men,
business.
yeah.
But I'm saying that with a non-Jew, it's not saying that the halachically it doesn't create a mamzer. So if a Jewish woman
And they also
has
recognize
relations with a
bigamy or
it
polygamy.
doesn't create mamzerim if it's non-Jewish in terms of the status. So that so Israel is much worse. So in America, if a Jewish woman has relations with a Gentile and then marries a Jewish man,
That doesn't
her
count.
kids are not considered mamzerim. But in Israel, it's
So it has to be a Jewish man before marriage to be a
because it
mamzer.
doesn't. If a Gentile has relations with a Jewish woman, it's not like they're married. As where if a Jewish man
Let's see.
has even out of marriage, it's considered an act of marriage, and they should get divorced. So even though they weren't married, they just had sexual relations, they have to go through
A divorce,
a
even though
ritualistic
they just had an
divorce.
affair. Now, and also some of the again, I'm sorry if I'm speaking out of school here, and I don't want to encourage anti-Semites, but my understanding is that some of the Haredim also practice polygamy.
Well, I mean, that's
Because that's what the Bible, the Torah. I mean, this is where Mormonism got
was
this.
Rabbeinu Tam. I mean, Rabbeinu Gershon 1,000 years ago,
Yeah,
who I think negotiated Vatican IV, the Fourth Lateran Council about money lending, also did the polygamy ban, but it only applied to Ashkenazic Jews. So there were many Sephardic countries, like I think possibly even Morocco and Yemen, have polygamy till today.
right.
And
And Muslims
Israel
do.
outlawed polygamy, but they grandfathered in. So Israel polygamy is
Well, it
illegal,
might be kind of an
but if you come
informal
from
sort of
Morocco or
underground thing.
Yemen, that they'll grandfather in. But there's occasionally cases of mostly rabbis, God forbid, that attempt to practice polygamy, and they're arrested
I've heard about this.
in Israel. But I mean, obviously, if you read
Well,
the
how are they
Torah,
viewed amongst the Haredim?
well, polygamy is not accepted. I mean, if
Okay,
the Rabbeinu Tam forbid it 1,000 years ago, and
okay,
it's only in a few Sephardic countries like Tunisia, Morocco,
I
Yemen,
understand. And
that
plus,
it
in
was that
Islamic,
I say
I
that
think in
Haredim
Muslim
sin.
countries
There's
they do.
millions, there's hundreds of thousands, maybe more than a million Haredim. People are people. So if there's a million Haredim, there's going to be a lot of sinners. And that's why I mentioned, we started out talking about, um, redeeming captives, the prison is not considered the right sentence, and how successful is the Haredi community at ousting misbehaviors, and certainly like the Haredi community is rampant with corruption, even if it's homosexuality, or saying just because that they're serious religious people doesn't
Right.
mean that there's not a sizable chunk of the population that violates their own law.
What about homosexuality? What do they view? What's the view on that?
Well, I mean, God forbid, it's one of the most egregious sins, but
Okay.
it's still semi-common.
But it's okay for women, apparently. It's just men.
Well, I mean, it's definitely not recommended and saying, but
No,
people
it's
are
not
people,
condoned. It's not
and
condoned.
it becomes more cultural and blood. So, so
And
to
also,
say
I want to bring up this issue because it's in the news right now. what about abortion?
Yeah, I mean, that's the biggest issue of the story. Like, you know,
Of
we're already
course, of course.
almost at the hour. The reality is the Orthodox Jews are very pro-life. The one difference between Christians and Jews is the Talmud makes clearly that we favor the life of the mother over the child. If there's a case in
Right.
pregnancy where it's either the mother would live or the child will live, Jewish law favors the mother, as opposed to some fundamentalist Christians favor the child. Although in terms of
I don't
abortion,
think that's true. I mean, I think that if a woman is going to die unless she has an abortion, I think that I don't think there's any religion that favors the mother, the unborn child, in that very rare case. Now, in
yeah, it's
today's
so rare.
medicine,
It's
it's very
unclear
rare.
if like if it's even happened. But I believe that. I mean, I'm not going
No,
to
it
speak
can
for
happen.
Christian. I believe that there's some Christians who uh, would disagree with that. And in terms of like the friendship
Maybe I
circle,
doubt it.
if you're
Maybe.
in Orthodox culture, there's a large amount of mentally disabled children, and you know Israel has very good health care, and most of the time they know they're going to give birth, and like I meant like reincarnation and various beliefs that people tell each other that the souls of righteous people are
Right.
reincarnated into. But if you're in a Haredi community, go to synagogue, um, there's almost always disabled kids there,
Yes,
and usually the mother knew, and it's considered commendable to have the child
I agree.
and
And
not
it
abort.
is.
But I'm saying in Orthodox Judaism, it's that. So a lot of rabbis would give a heter for an abortion in that case, but you could see just anecdotally by the large numbers of people like that in the Orthodox community, you could see that a lot of
Right.
those
And then, of
women
course, liberal
have
Jews.
those children. Um, but Israel is one of the largest places in abortion. I think the number per capita of abortions is even higher, and maybe the highest in the world.
Really.
In Israel, the health minister of Israel has formally condemned, possibly America condemning and saying that just like homosexuality, that Israel, I think, has free abortions in the army. There's
Well,
unbelievable
they have
amounts.
health care. They get,
Yeah, there's unbelievable
statewide
amounts
health.
of abortions in
That's
the
terrible. That's
it,
terrible. I mean, and I think liberal Jews tend to be very pro-choice. And I'll just recount a comment that was made to me by a liberal woman, a Jewish woman, right after this news broke about Roe versus Wade, in that she said she resents the influence of fundamentalist Christians as a Jew. She resents it because the idea that anybody would ban abortion. And so my reaction to that was, well, what are you talking about? Is abortion a Jewish ritual or something? I mean, in a sense, the Jewish people, I mean, the children of Israel in biblical times, one of the things that moved them away from the pagan world was their rejection of the ritual around the idol Moloch, where they would throw the baby into the burning belly of the statue. And that, we utterly rejected abortion and infanticide or anything else that involved killing the baby, born or unborn. It's not a
who's the
Jewish
we? I mean, because I've even like the reform actually temporarily took out but re-put in. So like in terms of the reform action, like protecting abortion is one of the main political lobby views. I saw Jennifer Gray was on The View, Dirty Dancing. Jerry Orbach. My mother, my grandparents loved Jerry Orbach, and I think Dirty Dancing was one of the main movies where they had like their abortions. One of the major parts of the story. She gives
was abortion in that movie? I don't remember that being in that movie.
She Patrick Swayze, one of the dance instructors, she gives money to so that she could have an abortion. And then it goes wrong, like because
I thought the
goes
thing
wrong
with that
versus
was that
way, and Jerry Orbach, who plays the doctor in that, helps her out.
I've never seen that entire movie. I just thought it was about a nice Jewish girl falling in love with a handsome Shagets. But
well, it is, but I think abortion, it's because it's one of the most famous, especially like Jewish cast movies. Jennifer Grey, Jerry
yeah, it
Orbach.
is.
But abortion's part of the movie, and and she does help this woman have an abortion.
Okay.
And
And look, I mean, it is a,
she was on The View this week. Whoopi Goldberg. They brought her in because she was American Culture, one of the most famous movies that was one of the first movies to cover the abortion issue. But you're saying who's the we, and if you're talking like Torah, like I just was telling you about like the Moiser, saying like a court, like handing someone over to the authorities even if they're guilty is one of the worst offenses in Judaism. But a lot of the Jewish community, is even Orthodox community, is like we turned against that, and certainly like God forbid it's going to be probably the Jewish community on the forefront of trying to protect abortion rights in America.
Mm.
I mean, it is. If you saw just in the news this week that.
Well, yeah, but the thing is, I this is one of the criticisms, frankly, that I have with Jewish liberal organizations like the Anti-Defamation League and other, the sort of the establishment Jewish Federation, if you will, in the United States, is that they are getting involved in issues that have nothing to do with Judaism. Abortion has nothing to do with Judaism.
Judaism, what Jews do, or religion. So like the reform represents.
Yeah, but it's not a Jewish issue.
30% of American Jews, and
yeah.
the abortion issue is more important than Israel. And it's saying so.
But it has Jews nothing to do with Judaism.
Or is it what our understanding of the religion is?
It has nothing to do with the Jewish faith. It has to do with if they want to be pro-abortion, then they can join NARAL or Planned
They don't. I'm saying the reform.
It's not a Jewish.
It's the largest organization of Jews in America, and this is what they're doing.
I know, and I find it to be wrong because it's not a Jewish issue. It has nothing to do with the Torah. It has nothing to do with Israel. It has nothing to do with. I mean, is abortion like a Jewish ritual? It's a separate issue that they can get into if they're into that by joining NARAL or joining some of these liberal groups that promote abortion. That's my only beef with this. They're speaking when they do this, and they speak as Jews. We support abortion, when in fact Judaism doesn't say anything about abortion. Really, it does.
It mentions in the Talmud that it's less strict for non-Jews. Like there's a statement in the Talmud that an abortion is acceptable for a non-Jew up to 40 days. For a Jew, it's not recommended at all.
But their position is often
for a non-Jew that it's acceptable up to 40 days.
Well, then their position is often contradicts that right off the bat. They believe in abortion on demand. I mean, there are some states. There were these two legislators in California who actually presented. I don't think that, God forbid, they were Jewish, but they presented a proposal which would have allowed abortion 2 weeks after the baby's already born. I'm just saying that this is not a Jewish stand. It's sort of with, it's even if the Talmud says something about it, it's still not, the Talmud says about a lot of things that aren't really part of our normative faith. Anyway, Dooovid.
You're going the merry ground, but it is because.
And the same thing with gay marriage.
Because that represents the plurality of American Jews, and that's what the most mainstream American
maybe
Jewish
they do, but
organizations are doing.
We're going about.
I don't disagree with you, but just to wipe it off like.
No, I don't wipe it off. I know that the majority of Jews, and the same thing with gay marriage. It's not a Jewish issue. Join, the Glisten or whatever these groups are, and do it that way. But to try to do it, wrap yourself in a cloak of Judaism, no, it's not. Anyway, Dooovid, we're sort of reaching toward the end. I do want to mention briefly that my new book is out now. I am going to mention that. I mean, I feel almost nervous about mentioning the name of this book, The Biden Coup. It's the socio-political effects of an illegitimate regime. There, I said it. Now, again, I'm not making any, the book is strictly opinion, and it has more to do with sociology. I don't, make any hard claims here, but I take a look at the effects of that last election on the American public. And I do note that an average of 60% of Republicans, even now, polled, and probably a pretty large number of Democrats, do believe that there were irregularities, okay, we'll put it that way, in the last election, and that has affected our whole our society and our culture. So that's what my book's about. It's
It's
available at
important.
Amazon.
Yeah, it's important. And if you send me a copy of next week, you want to, just
Yeah,
the
that's just
Rumble
into it.
or
If I,
the the more
yeah,
free speech platforms
if we
and
talk
talk
about it, I'll
about
have to
that.
shut off YouTube. We'll just do it on Rumble. But yes, I'll send you. Do you want? I'll send you the ebook. The softcover actually is not online yet. I think it's going to be online hopefully this weekend. That takes this a little bit more involved. But thank you. Yeah, I appreciate that. And
Just to mention quickly,
yeah,
uh, you know, the violence has increased, and there's God
yeah,
forbid
it has.
been multiple murders in Israel this week. I mean, they restricted Jews from the Temple Mount. Ramadan ended, and so relatively, the end of Ramadan was semi-peaceful. But after that, and now, the coalition and Hamas is calling for more attacks, and the Arab members of the coalition are threatening to pull out. I mean, Israel's probably strong. Like my take was, God forbid, there's just going to be a lot of internal violence within Israel, even though Israel is having stronger relations with the neighbors in terms of like military powers, like Egypt, alliance to UAE. But the situation with the Palestinians seems to be deteriorating. And this week there was just today, horrible axe
Yeah,
murder, three
in
people murdered, another three people just
Tel Aviv, no less.
and there was other like ramming and a few murders this week. So God forbid.
How does the society deal with that, Dooovid? I mean, I know it's a big question, but
It's probably just going to be that, God forbid, like shootings in America, the status quo there. And
it's always been a problem in Israel, going all the way back to the beginning. And I think the Israelis do their best to try to find these people and stop them when they can. But ultimately, if somebody wants to,
there's hundreds of thousands of them
I know, if
and
somebody
then
wants
trying
to
to
shoot
stop
you,
them incites more of them to want to do it. And also just to mention, I mean, we could save that for, but just to mention, God forbid, this was a bad week, and who knows what's going to be. Although Biden looks like he's confirmed a trip to Israel in the next few months, and it looks like they're going to turn it into some sort of summit with other Arab nations. So there's the dual prong
yeah.
where Israel is being strengthened with the Arab neighbors, in the military's governance,
Well, that's good news. I mean,
making peace and ties. Although the internal Palestinian situation is deteriorating. So in terms of like a military army waging war against Israel, that is decreasing. Besides for Iran, Hezbollah, Syria, the situation, God forbid, but the internal violence of just random terror attacks and crime is, is, God forbid, possibly the worst it's been in a long time.
all right. Well, on that happy note, what do you have coming up on anything on your YouTube channel?
No, I started writing. So Jennifer,
Good.
Week in Review encouraged me. So I've written an essay each week, and I'm focusing on consciousness. And I've actually put on the chess server because I'm a reasonably high ranked on the chess server. So I got over 200 views on more than any of the others on the chess server. I wrote an article on cognitive dissonance, just the history of it, and Leon Festinger, interesting, Jewish immigrant, and if you want to talk, we usually talk about the politics, but the cognitive revolution, the switch from behavioralism to cognitive approaches, and a lot of the leading names were Jews, like Festinger, cognitive dissonance, Herbert Chase and Simon, chunking theory, Noam Chomsky, universal grammar. I'm going to write an article on decision making in chess, but so
I'm interested. No, I mean my friend, the late Dr. Samuel Blumenfeld, used to talk about how our education system switched over from one based on the development of cognitive thinking to one that's based on behaviorism, and he goes into how that happened, and he points out that look-say reading was a part of that agenda. But yeah, I'm interested. Maybe send me the article. And by the way, I should give a quick shout out to none other than Dr. Noam Chomsky, He gave an interview recently. You can see it on YouTube. He looks bizarre. I mean, the man must be in his late 80s. He's really woolly and he looks very wizened. But he said that there is only one statesman on the world scene right now who is calling for a negotiated peace between Russia and Ukraine. All the other statesmen are pushing for World War III with a nuclear power. And he did say that that one statesman is none other than Donald J. Trump. So anyway, Dooovid.
Yeah, it's interesting that he was able to pivot from that. Unfortunately, I mean, his linguistics universal grammar was largely rejected, but he revolutionized the field and was able to pivot his position in science to being a social commentator. And ironically, his
I didn't hear that his linguistic theories were rejected. I mean, his
concept of universal grammar. I mean, it's what happened was the neuroscience, the cognitive revolution. You had behavioralism, where people didn't really focus on thoughts or feelings; they were just the outputs of psychometric. And then you had psychological theories like Freud of the cognitive mechanisms of mind.
So I don't know much about Chomsky.
I mean, universal grammar was this concept that there's this internal mentalese in the brain.
Well, his theory, and I actually
talked of all people, but it didn't really stand up to the neuroscientific. In the 80s, in the 90s, neuroscience and brain imaging got so much better that these older theories that were based on introspection and intelligence and thought of how the mind worked now have to correspond to neural correlates and how the brain works. So his theory, even though he basically is the father of the field of linguistics, his theory has largely been rejected.
All right. Well, my understanding is that, was that his theory was, and this is the only thing I know about it, that language occurred spontaneously. It was not it didn't evolve. It just happened. It was like a big bang, that man inherently knew and could use language. And I had Noam Chomsky on my show years ago.
I call it mentalese, that there's this universal language in all brains from evolution, and then from there derives.
Well, the point is that idea contradicts evolution. And I had him on my show to talk about politics, and I brought this up at the very beginning of the show, and I said, your theory of that linguistics was a spontaneous event among all human beings instantaneously, however that happened, doesn't that contradict Darwin's theory of evolution, which would hold that it evolved over millions of years? And doesn't that also comport with the biblical theory, which is that when the first thing that God did when he created Adam was he gave him language. He gave him the ability to name all of the creatures of the world. And Chomsky absolutely exploded. I remember it. I wish I had a tape of it.
I don't mean to keep dragging. I have this on my, because you interviewed Dershowitz also, and I have this on my YouTube channel. When Alan Dershowitz came to the synagogue, I had my bar mitzvah in Detroit, and I recorded it, put on my channel. And he said, he was in Borough Park, Brooklyn as a kid, and was an anti-Zionist. And he went to a Zionist summer camp, and Noam Chomsky was his counselor.
Chomsky was originally a Zionist.
Yeah, so Dershowitz tells the story when he was a kid that Noam Chomsky was a Zionist summer camp counselor, and he was an anti-Zionist, and Noam Chomsky was preaching Zionism to him.
Now that we're on the topic, I was actually a talk show host at a Salem radio station in Quincy, Massachusetts. My show used to come on right after that of Ray Flynn, who was a former ambassador to the Vatican and mayor of Boston. And I had on, at that time, I interviewed Chomsky and Dershowitz, and I suggested that they both come and join me together, and we could have like a very interesting roundtable conversation. And they both agreed. And I sent out a note to the media, and I had calls from all over the country. This was going to be a big deal. I had people from around the world that were going to watch this thing. It was huge. And oh my God, I was so excited. 3 days before, Dershowitz called and he canceled. And then he said, well, I'll reschedule. And then Chomsky backed out. and it never happened. Oh, I was so upset when Dershowitz canceled. I'm like,
Maybe
I'll
somehow we'll put it together. We'll get
no,
Noam
they'll never
Chomsky,
do it.
Alan
But I remember
Dershowitz,
I
again
actually said
for
to
Partners in Torah.
Dershowitz, I said, if you don't come on, I'm going to sue you.
Okay,
Oh
well,
man,
at least we
that
finished
was
on a more positive note. So Shabbat Shalom, and
Shabbat Shalom.
give a copy of my book. And next week, hopefully we'll speak off YouTube about your book.
Thank you. All right, Dooovid.